The night Hogwarts chose Draco. At 2 minutes past 2, Hogwarts made a decision. It was not the kind of decision that announced itself with moving staircases or restless portraits. It was quieter than that, so quiet it could be mistaken for nothing at all. A shift in the castle's attention. A small adjustment in the way torchlight rested on stone. A subtle patience gathering in the corridors, as though the ancient building had been waiting for the right moment to open a door it kept hidden even from itself. In the Slytherin dormitory beneath the lake, Draco Malfoy lay awake. He had been awake for a long time, long enough that the edges of sleep had stopped trying to claim him. Long enough that the dark canopy above his bed had begun to feel like a ceiling rather than a shadow. Long enough that he could sense each breath as something separate from him, steady and automatic, as if his body had learned to continue without asking permission. The room was still. The other beds were quiet shapes behind heavy curtains, a neat row of silence in a place that usually felt like a performance even in the dark. The lake pressed against the windows, turning the outside world into a deep, wavering green-black. It made the dormitory feel sealed away from everything else. Safe in the way sealed things are safe, and trapped in the same way. Draco kept his hands folded on top of the blanket, as though he might convince the world he belonged to rest. He had learned over years how to look composed while his mind moved in slow circles. His thoughts were not sharp tonight. They were tired. They drifted, returned, drifted again. He did not let them land too clearly on any single thing, because clarity had become dangerous. Clear thoughts tended to become decisions, and decisions tended to become consequences. He watched the faint outline of the window and tried to focus on something simple. The idea of morning arriving. The idea of the castle filling again with noise and schedule and ordinary demands. The ordinary had become strangely precious. Then he noticed something that did not belong. A thin line of pale light, no wider than a thread, slipping across the floor near his trunk. At first he assumed it came from the window. The lake did strange things to light, but this line was too clean, too deliberate. It did not ripple. It did not soften. It rested on the stone like a mark drawn by a careful hand. Draco did not move immediately. He simply stared, letting the sight become undeniable. His mind tried to offer safe explanations. A latch not fully shut, a charm still active, a careless mistake he would correct in the morning. His mind did this because safe explanations were the easiest to live with. But he knew his own habits. He knew how he packed his trunk, how he checked it, how he repeated small actions until they felt sealed. He was not careless. Not anymore. Slowly, he sat up. The movement felt louder than it should, though the dormitory remained silent. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and placed his feet on the cold stone. The chill grounded him. It reminded him he was real, here, inside this room, beneath the lake. He crossed the short distance to the trunk with measured steps. He knelt. The pale line of light widened slightly, as though it recognized his proximity. His fingers hovered over the latch. There was a moment, small, almost invisible, when he considered leaving it, when he considered lying back down and letting the morning handle it. He had become skilled at postponing things until they dulled. He had become skilled at surviving by not looking too closely. But the line of light remained, patient and steady. It did not behave like an accident. Draco opened the trunk. The light did not flare. It did not burst outward. It simply breathed, softening the interior shadows enough to reveal what lay inside. Everything was arranged as he always kept it: folded robes, stacked books, Carefully placed personal items that served no real purpose except to remind him he still had preferences, still had an identity beyond other people's expectations. Beneath the top layer, however, something new sat, where nothing should have been. A parcel. It was wrapped in paper the color of bone, tied with a dark ribbon that looked too matte to be silk. It had no name. No seal, no visible enchantment. Draco stared at it without touching it. His mind tightened, instinctively bracing for the shape of a trap. He had learned to treat gifts as demands. He had learned to treat surprises as threats. He had learned to ask what someone wanted before asking what something was. But the parcel did not feel like anyone's hand. It felt like the castle. Not in a sentimental way. Not like the stories that claimed Hogwarts loved its students. Draco did not need affection from stone walls. What he felt was older than affection, a sense of attention, of recognition, as though the castle had become aware of him in a way it had not been aware of him before. He lifted the parcel. It was lighter than he expected, but not empty. The paper was dry and cool, as if it had been kept somewhere untouched by time. The ribbon untied easily. Draco peeled back the wrapping and found a small object resting inside. A key. Not a modern key. Not the kind that opened classroom cupboards or locked cabinets. This key was old, forged of dull silver, etched with tiny patterns like vines or worn runes. The head of it had once been shaped into something serpent-like, though time had softened the details. It did not gleam. It did not try to impress. It simply existed, calm and heavy with purpose. Beneath the key lay a strip of parchment. No words. Only a symbol. A circle split by a vertical line, and at the base of that line, a small, star-shaped mark. Draco's throat tightened. Symbols belonged to allegiances and expectations. Symbols belonged to history, and names that carried weight. He had lived too long inside symbols. He held the parchment between his fingers and tried to place it. It was not the dark mark. Not anything he recognized from family crests or old pure-blood books. It felt older than those things, older than fashion, older than pride. He closed his hand around the key. It was colder than the room, colder than the lake-dark air. He felt it like a fact. For a long moment, he remained kneeling beside the trunk, listening to the silence as if the silence might explain itself. But the dormitory offered nothing. The castle offered nothing. The key offered nothing. Only the feeling that this night had turned quietly toward him. Draco stood. He placed the key in his pocket and folded the parchment carefully, as though careless handling might destroy whatever thin logic held the moment together. He dressed without haste, pulling on robes with the same careful movements he used when he needed to keep his mind steady. He did not wake anyone. He did not pause to check whether someone watched him from behind a curtain. He did not allow himself the humiliation of fearing his own classmates in his own dormitory. The stillness belonged to everyone equally. He left the room. The Slytherin common room was empty, lit in green tones that felt deeper at night. The lake beyond the windows made the room look submerged, as though Slytherin existed at the bottom of the world. Draco crossed it without lingering, not because he hated it, but because he had learned that lingering in familiar places could become a way of never leaving. He opened the door and stepped into the corridor. Hogwarts at night felt different. It was not merely quiet. It was wide. In daylight, the castle was filled with motion and purpose and crowding. At night, it became what it had always been beneath the school, a vast, ancient structure designed to last longer than the lives inside it. Draco walked with measured steps, letting his senses adjust. The torchlight here was thinner, spaced farther apart. Shadows rested naturally in corners and along arches. The air smelled faintly of stone and old wood, of a place that had held countless seasons. He moved upward, not toward the great hall, not toward the library, not toward any place where he might find a teacher or another student awake. He followed instinct, and behind that instinct he felt something else. The subtle guidance of the symbol in his pocket, the star at the base of the line, as though it tugged gently whenever he reached the correct turn. He passed sleeping portraits. He passed suits of armor that stood too still to be comforting. He passed a corridor where the stones underfoot changed, becoming less worn, as if fewer people walked here. The castle's normal tricks did not bother him tonight. No staircases shifted. No doorways teased him with impossible turns. Everything felt oddly cooperative. That was what unsettled him most. Eventually, he reached a short hallway that ended in a blank wall. No tapestry. No door. No window. A dead end. Draco stopped. The torch behind him cast his shadow forward. His robe hem lay still against the stone. The air here felt slightly different. Cooler, steadier, as if the wall held back a space that did not share the corridor's ordinary atmosphere. He removed the parchment from his pocket and held it up to the wall, not because he expected the wall to respond, but because he did not know what else to do. The symbol looked simple in the dim light. The split circle, the star mark. For several breaths, nothing happened. Then the star mark began to glow. Not bright, not alarming, just enough to create a small, steady point of light, like a patient ember. As Draco watched, the glow spilled onto the stone and revealed something he would not have noticed otherwise. A tiny depression in the wall, star-shaped, no bigger than a fingertip. His hand went to his pocket without hesitation. He pressed the key into the star-shaped depression. The stone did not crack. It did not shift in a dramatic way. Instead, it softened around the metal as though it remembered what it was meant to do. The wall's surface blurred slightly, then sharpened again into a new shape, the faint outline of a doorway, emerging as if drawn from inside the stone outward. At the center of the outline, a keyhole formed. Draco withdrew the key and held it still for a moment, his fingers tightening around the dull silver. He understood something now with a clarity that made his chest feel tight. This was not an accident, not a random enchantment, not a prank. This was a mechanism designed to remain hidden unless a very specific object met a very specific mark. This door had been waiting. For him or for someone like him, or for someone who carried the right combination of fear and stubbornness to step out into the night and follow something unknown. Draco inserted the key into the new keyhole. He turned it. The door opened soundlessly, revealing darkness beyond. Darkness that looked deeper than the corridor should have contained, as though the castle had folded space inward to create a hidden vein of itself. Draco stood at the threshold. A part of him wanted to step back, not because he thought something would attack him, but because stepping forward felt like admitting that he was capable of being chosen by something he did not control. Draco Malfoy had spent his life believing choice belonged to names, to power, to inherited certainty. The idea that Hogwarts itself might be offering him anything at all, felt like a dangerous kind of hope. He stepped inside, the doorway sealed behind him, and in the darkness ahead, far down the passage, a faint glow appeared, steady, pale, and unmistakably shaped like the star mark on his parchment, as though something had been awakened there long before he arrived. Draco's hand tightened in his pocket around the folded symbol. He began to walk toward that light, not fast, not slow, just forward. because the night had already made its decision, and now it was Draco's turn to make his. The darkness beyond the hidden door was not empty. It had shape. It had depth. It had the steady, unnatural stillness of a place that had been sealed, not because it was forgotten, but because it was kept. Draco stood for a moment just past the threshold, letting the sensation of separation settle over him. Hogwarts had 1,000 corridors and stairwells, 1,000 spaces that could feel lonely at night, but this was different. This felt like stepping into the pause between heartbeats. The air itself seemed to hold a careful quiet, as though sound was something that belonged outside and had been politely refused entry. There was light ahead, faint, pale, and star-shaped in its presence, not bright enough to throw strong shadows, but strong enough to insist on direction. It did not flicker like torchlight. It did not sway as though moved by drafts. It remained steady, like a point of truth that did not need to announce itself to be certain. Draco began to walk. The corridor was narrow, carved from stone, that looked older than the castle's most familiar walls. The blocks were fitted with a precision that suggested hands with patience, hands that built for centuries rather than for years. The stone was not damp, despite how deep it felt. It was dry and cool, the kind of cool that reached the skin without hostility. It carried the faint scent of mineral and thyme, a smell like rain that never arrives, like a cave that has decided it will not grow moss. His footsteps were soft, not because he tried to creep, but because the stone here absorbed movement differently, as if the corridor were built to swallow disturbance. The sound of his own breathing felt muted too, pulled inward, made private. He kept one hand near his pocket where the parchment lay folded. The other remained loose at his side, fingers occasionally brushing the fabric of his robe, as though to reassure himself that he was still made of ordinary things. As he moved forward, he began to notice the subtle architecture of guidance. The pale glow ahead was not simply a light at the end of a passage. It seemed to lean, almost imperceptibly, toward one side or the other, as the corridor forked. It did not behave like a sign. It behaved like a preference. It suggested a path without forcing it, allowing Draco the dignity of choosing even when the choice was clearly shaped. He turned when the glow suggested turning. He descended a short set of steps that curved gently, the way old stairwells do when they were carved with a sense of elegance rather than convenience. The walls on either side were etched with patterns so shallow they could be missed entirely, lines like vines, loops like runes, worn down not by time alone, but by touch. Draco's fingers did not reach out, but his eyes tracked the carvings, his mind recognizing that these were not decorative. They felt like the remains of rules, or names, or promises cut into stone and allowed to fade when they were no longer meant to be read by everyone. The corridor narrowed slightly, then opened into a small antechamber. Draco stopped at its threshold. The antechamber was not large. It was shaped like a circle pressed into the rock, a modest space meant for pause rather than gathering. The light here was a little stronger, rising from a small star mark carved into the floor at the chamber's center. The star was not raised, not inlaid with gems or metal. It was simply carved and filled with a pale glow that seemed to come from within the stone. On the wall opposite Draco, there was a panel. It was the size of a book cover, set flush into the stone, and etched with the same symbol from the parchment, a circle split by a vertical line, the star mark at the base. The carvings were cleaner here, as though they had been protected from wear. As Draco stepped closer, the star mark on the panel brightened slightly, responding to his presence with a quiet recognition. He did not rush. He stood before the panel and let his breathing remain slow, controlled, steady. He let himself observe the small details, the faint seam around the panel's edges, the way the stone near it looked smoother, the subtle sense that this wall had been handled carefully by whatever magic lived here. He raised his hand, His fingertips hovered over the split circle, and for a brief moment something like resistance met him, not a physical resistance, but a hesitation in the air, as if the corridor itself needed to decide whether he was allowed to continue. Draco's fingers touched the stone. The panel warmed under his skin. Not hot, not burning, but alive in a restrained way. A line of pale light traced itself down the vertical split of the circle, traveling slowly, evenly, like ink filling a groove. When it reached the star mark at the base, the star pulsed once, and the air in the antechamber shifted, loosening its hold. A doorway formed in the wall beside the panel. It did not swing outward. It did not creak. It did not reveal itself with drama. The outline simply appeared, stone becoming the suggestion of an entrance, and then the reality of one. The opening beyond it was dim, but not dark. There was a quiet clarity waiting there, as though the corridor's deeper interior held its own form of light. Draco stepped through. The space beyond was a larger chamber, circular like the first, but expanded, built with a sense of purpose that went beyond passage. The ceiling arched smoothly overhead, the stone polished to a low sheen as though it had been cared for over centuries. Shallow shelves were carved into the walls in evenly spaced segments, creating a ring of alcoves that held objects arranged with deliberate restraint. The chamber did not feel like a hoard. It felt like a record. The objects were not displayed for admiration. They were placed for keeping. Draco's eyes moved from shelf to shelf, taking in shapes without fully understanding them. There were thin volumes bound in faded leather, their spines unmarked, their covers worn at the edges as though they had been opened many times by careful hands. There were small pieces of metal, rings, clasps, fragments of something once larger, each one set on its own small stone platform. There were folded fabrics, dry and preserved, colors muted by age, ash, midnight, deep green, a pale gray that looked like morning fog. Nothing here glittered, nothing here tried to impress. And that, to Draco, made it feel more powerful than any display case in a wealthy home. At the chamber's center stood a pedestal made of pale stone. On top of it sat a shallow basin, also pale, its rim etched with the vine-like patterns Draco had already seen in the corridor. The basin did not contain water. It held a surface like light held still, thin, glassy, and not entirely reflective. It looked like a boundary between this chamber and somewhere else. Draco approached the pedestal slowly. As he moved, the glow beneath the floor star seemed to follow him in subtle increments, strengthening slightly as he neared the basin. The air around the pedestal felt different too, denser, as though the chamber's quiet had gathered itself into that point. He stopped at the basin's edge and looked down. At first, the surface seemed blank. Then, as if responding to the simple fact of being observed, it began to shift, not with ripples like water, but with a gradual revealing, the way fog thins on a hillside, to show what has always been there. Draco's own reflection did not appear. Instead, faint shapes emerged, lines and forms that did not quite become images, like memories refusing to take full shape. He did not touch the basin. He simply watched. He let himself feel the discomfort of being near something that might know him. He had spent too long managing what people saw and what they believed, building walls out of arrogance and precision. The idea of a place that might look past those walls without effort was unsettling in a way he could not disguise from himself. His gaze drifted from the basin to the shelf closest to the pedestal, drawn by the sense that something there was meant for him. A narrow wooden box sat in a shallow alcove, its lid carved with the split circle symbol. The carving was clean and sharp, as though it had been made more recently than the other markings, or as though the chamber had preserved it more carefully. Draco's hand moved almost on its own. He lifted the box, It was lighter than it looked. The wood was smooth, warm, where the chamber was cool, as if the box carried its own quiet temperature. He opened the lid. Inside lay a single sheet of parchment, thicker than normal parchment, its surface slightly textured. The writing on it was not inked in black. It was pressed into the page in a silvery impression, as though the words had been embossed rather than written. Draco read in silence. The message did not greet him. It did not flatter him. It did not accuse him. It stated, with restrained clarity, that Hogwarts kept more than hallways and classrooms. It kept witness. It kept a record of choices that happened when no one watched, and of moments too small for gossip, but too important for the castle to ignore. It spoke of protection, offered quietly, not as a reward, but as an acknowledgement that some people moved through the world, burdened by stories they did not entirely choose. The words were not sentimental. They were not soothing in the obvious way. They were calm, steady, and uncomfortably precise. Then they became specific. They referenced a place Draco already knew too well, a place that had once felt like the only room in the castle that understood desperation, a place that had given him what he asked for without judging the shape of his asking, a place that could become anything, including a trap made of his own fear. The Room of Requirement. As Draco read that name pressed in silver, the chamber's quiet seemed to deepen, as though the stone itself recognized the weight of the association. Draco's grip on the parchment tightened slightly, not enough to crumple it, but enough that he felt the edges press into his skin. He did not allow his mind to tumble into memory. He did not allow images to sharpen. He held himself steady, because steadiness was how he survived. But the name struck him in the way a distant bell strikes through fog, low and unavoidable. The message continued. It instructed him to bring the key. Not as a command, but as a sequence that had already been set in motion. Key, corridor, chamber, room. As if the night had been built like a path of stones across water, and Draco had already stepped onto the first. At the bottom of the parchment, beneath the final line, the symbol appeared again. The split circle, the star mark, pressed into the page with the same silvery certainty. Draco lowered the parchment slowly. The chamber remained unchanged. The basin remained still. The shelves did not rearrange themselves to offer explanation. The glow from the star in the floor did not brighten into spectacle. Everything remained restrained, as though the place respected the privacy of what it offered. Draco folded the parchment and set it back in the wooden box. He closed the lid. He returned it to its alcove, exactly as he found it. The carefulness of the action mattered more than he wanted to admit. He turned back to the pedestal, looking once more into the basin. This time, the surface revealed something clearer. A corridor, different from the one he stood in now, yet similar in its old stone and quiet air. A door, outlined in faint light, the same star-shaped depression. A hand, his own hand, recognizable by the pale skin and the precise way the fingers held themselves, reaching toward the star mark. It was not a prophecy. It was not theatrical. It was the basin reflecting the path he had already taken, confirming it with the calm inevitability of record. Then the image shifted again. For a moment, Draco saw the seventh-floor corridor, the blank wall where the Room of Requirement would appear. He saw the door forming. He saw the handle. He saw the quiet seriousness of stepping through. The basin's surface did not show what would happen beyond. It showed only the threshold, as though the chamber refused to intrude on a choice that belonged to Draco alone. The image faded. The basin returned to stillness. Draco stood for several breaths, letting the message settle. He did not like being guided. He did not like being led from one place to another by something he could not argue with. But this guidance felt different from the expectations he had known. It did not demand performance. It did not demand loyalty to a name. It did not demand cruelty disguised as strength. It asked only movement. Draco turned and walked back through the doorway. The antechamber greeted him again with its single glowing star in the floor. The panel on the wall dimmed slightly as he passed, as if acknowledging that he had received what it meant to offer. The corridor beyond seemed less dense now, as though the path had accepted him and no longer needed to resist him. He followed the faint guidance of the light, retracing his route with quiet precision. The corridor curved. The steps rose. The stone blocks shifted subtly in texture beneath his eyes, returning him gradually to the castle's more familiar construction. At last, the hidden doorway appeared again. It waited like a seam in reality. Draco reached it, and the keyhole revealed itself without hesitation, as though it remembered the metal that had turned inside it. He inserted the key, turned it, and the door opened. He stepped out into Hogwarts proper. The corridor outside looked almost too ordinary after the hidden passage, stone worn by countless feet, torchlight that flickered with a living flame, the faint sense of portraits sleeping behind their frames. The air here carried the soft residue of the castle's everyday life, even at night. The hidden door sealed behind him, leaving only a blank wall. Draco stood still, letting his senses recalibrate. He felt slightly altered, not in an obvious way, but in the quiet way that comes from having seen something true that no one else knows exists. The knowledge sat inside him, like a weight and a warmth at the same time. He began to walk. He moved through corridors with measured steadiness, not rushing, not pausing unnecessarily. He avoided the central staircases, where portraits might be more awake, and chose side routes where the castle slept more deeply. His mind stayed focused on sequence rather than emotion. 7th floor, blank wall, 3 passes, a clear need. He passed the library corridor, where the air always felt cooler. He passed the shadowed arch that led toward classrooms. He passed a window where the night outside looked like a sheet of ink, the faintest thinning at its edge hinting that morning was still far away but not impossible. His hand brushed the key in his pocket. It did not feel colder now. It felt steady. As Draco climbed, the castle seemed to grow quieter, as though the upper floors were naturally further from the world's noise. The 7th floor corridor approached. The blank stretch of wall waited. Draco slowed as he neared it, not out of fear, but out of the strange respect that comes when a place has once shown you what you can become. He stopped in front of the wall. He let the thought form, not as a plea, not as a demand, but as a clear, calm need shaped by the night's path. The room of requirement responded. The door appeared. Draco's hand settled on the handle. He did not hesitate long enough for doubt to win. He opened the door and stepped through. The air on the other side felt different immediately. Smooth, more contained, like the inside of a held breath. The room beyond was not the cluttered vastness he remembered. It was something else, something intentionally shaped, and in the center of it, already waiting, was a dark table. On that table lay an object that made Draco stop so abruptly, his whole body stilled. A second key, identical in shape to the one in his pocket. Resting beside it was a small, pale stone pendant carved with a star. The pendant did not glow brightly. It warmed the air around it by the smallest degree, like a promise that did not need to shout. Draco stood at the threshold, the first key heavy in his pocket, the second key waiting on the table, and the pendant resting like the quiet center of a truth Hogwarts had been keeping sealed away. The room did not move, the castle did not rush him, but the moment held its own pressure. Not threatening, not cruel, simply inevitable. Because if there were two keys, then one of them was meant to open something that had never been opened for him before. And if Hogwarts had brought him here tonight, it was not to punish him for what he had been. It was to test what he would do when the only witness was stone, silence, and himself. The room of requirement did not feel like a room tonight. It felt like a decision made physical. Draco stood just inside the doorway, letting the air settle around him. The space held a smooth, contained quiet, as though the castle had wrapped this place in an extra layer of privacy. The light was steady and soft, not coming from torches or candles, but from the room itself, an even glow that erased harsh shadows and made everything feel calm in a way that was almost unsettling. The room was long and clean-lined, built around a single purpose: clarity. There were no piles of forgotten objects, no towering stacks, no chaotic clutter of desperate hiding. The shelves along the walls were empty, their surfaces bare and waiting. The stone floor was polished, unscarred. The air carried the faint scent of old wood and stone that had been warmed by time rather than flame. At the center stood a table of dark wood, plain and solid. On the table rested three things arranged with deliberate precision. A second key, identical in shape to the one in Draco's pocket. Dull silver, vine-like etchings, the softened hint of a serpent's form at the head. A pale stone pendant carved with a star at its center, its surface smooth and faintly warm, as though it held a quiet heartbeat. And a narrow strip of parchment, blank at first glance, as if it had been placed there to test whether he would reach for it at all. Draco did not move immediately. He let himself feel the strange tension of being offered something without understanding what it cost. He had been raised in a world where nothing was given freely, where gifts were bindings, where kindness was often a strategy wearing a gentle face. Even at Hogwarts, he had learned to interpret every interaction as a negotiation. But this room had no expression. It did not flatter him. It did not threaten him. It simply waited. Draco's gaze remained fixed on the second key. Two keys meant sequence. Two keys meant stages. The first key had opened a door that did not exist yesterday. The second key, waiting here as if it had always belonged to this table, suggested that the secret night was not one revelation, but a path designed to unfold slowly, carefully, like something ancient that knew suddenness was a kind of violence. He stepped closer. The closer he came, the more the pendant's warmth became noticeable. Not heat, not intensity, but a subtle easing in the air, like the feeling of standing near sunlit stone after being cold for too long. It was a small comfort, offered without performance. Draco reached into his pocket and closed his fingers around the first key. The familiar weight grounded him. He did not remove it yet. He simply held it there, a private anchor, while his eyes moved across the table. The blank parchment caught his attention next. It had no visible writing, no seal, no mark, except for a faint impression near one corner, so faint it could be mistaken for the texture of the paper itself. Draco leaned slightly, letting the light fall at a different angle. A star-shaped indentation, not inked, not drawn. Pressed into the parchment, as if it were part of the parchment's very making. Draco extended his hand and lifted the page between his fingers. It was heavier than ordinary parchment, its fibers denser, more refined. The star indentation seemed to deepen as he touched it, responding with a faint shimmer that disappeared the moment he tried to look directly at it. Then, without any flicker of spectacle, the parchment began to fill. Not with ink pooling or quill strokes appearing, but with silvery impressions pressing themselves into the page from within, as though the words were being formed by pressure rather than pigment. Draco read in silence. The message was longer than the one in the hidden chamber, and its tone was colder, not cruel, but precise. It described the room of requirement not as a place of comfort, but as a place of function, a room that became what was needed, but also a room that reflected what the seeker was truly asking for, whether the seeker admitted it or not. The words then turned toward the keys. The first key, it said, was not a key to a door. It was a key to permission, a key that granted entry into something Hogwarts kept sealed away from the ordinary life of the castle, not because it was dangerous in the simple sense, but because it was intimate, because it involved truths students and teachers alike often avoided, because the castle did not offer such things lightly. The second key, it explained, was not a key to permission. It was a key to consequence. Draco's fingers tightened slightly on the parchment, the edges pressing into his skin. Consequence had always been the shadow behind his life. Consequence was what his father spoke of, without speaking of it. Consequence was what people expected him to fear, and what they expected him to enforce on others. But this was different. This consequence sounded like an internal thing, a consequence that belonged to the self rather than to punishment. The parchment continued. It described a place within the room of requirement, an inner threshold the room could form, only under certain conditions. A chamber that did not appear for anyone who sought hiding, advantage, revenge, or attention. A chamber that would not open for someone who wanted to rewrite history into something convenient. It would open only for someone who was willing to face a truth without witnesses. Draco lowered the parchment slowly. The words did not vanish this time. They remained pressed into the page, steady and readable, as though the room intended for him to carry them, to revisit them, to be unable to claim later that he misunderstood. He placed the parchment back on the table carefully, aligning it exactly as it had been. Then he looked at the pendant again. Its warmth seemed to pulse faintly, though there was no visible light. Draco felt the warmth more in his palm than in the air now, as if the pendant's presence was reaching toward him, asking to be held. He did not pick it up yet. Instead, he took the first key from his pocket and placed it on the table beside the second, two identical shapes resting side by side. The sight unsettled him more than he expected. It made the entire night feel engineered, as if Hogwarts had prepared this moment long before Draco was old enough to understand the idea of being prepared for. He reached for the second key. His fingers closed around it, and a subtle shift ran through the room. Not a sound, not a movement, but a change in the way the air held itself. The room became slightly more attentive, as though it had been waiting for this exact contact. Draco held the key in his palm and let his breath remain slow. He did not like being guided, but he could feel it now. The room of requirement was shaping itself, responding to the second key the way it responded to need. The far wall, blank a moment ago, began to soften. At first, it looked like a trick of light, the stone surface becoming slightly less defined. Then the outline of an arch emerged, faint and pale, as if drawn by something beneath the wall rather than placed upon it. The arch grew clearer, the stone within it becoming darker, deeper, like a doorway forming into a space that had been folded away. Draco remained still until the doorway fully resolved. The opening was not large. It was tall enough for him to step through comfortably, but narrow, like an entrance meant for one person at a time. Beyond it was darkness, thicker than a corridor's darkness, denser than night shadow. It looked like the inside of a closed eye. Draco's grip tightened on the second key. He took one step forward. The pendant's warmth increased slightly, as though approving the movement. Not praising, not rewarding. Simply responding. Draco reached back toward the table and lifted the pendant. The stone was warm against his skin. Warmer than it had any right to be. The carved star in its center did not glow brightly, but as his fingers curled around it, he felt a subtle vibration, a quiet certainty, like the hum of a spell that had settled into place. He held the pendant and the second key, and then he stepped into the inner doorway. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air changed. The calm brightness of the outer room fell away behind him, replaced by a contained darkness that was not oppressive, but intimate. The space beyond felt smaller, not in dimension, but in focus, like a room designed to narrow the world down to only what mattered. The doorway behind him remained open, but the light from the outer room did not spill far. It retreated, as though respecting the boundary. Draco stood in the dimness and waited for his eyes to adjust. Slowly, the chamber revealed itself. It was circular, like the hidden chamber he had seen earlier, but more refined. The walls were stone, smooth and dark, carved in a spiral pattern that drew the eye inward. The ceiling was low and gently domed, creating the sensation of being held inside a quiet shell. At the center of the chamber stood a cabinet built into the floor, its top flush with the stone, like a sealed hatch. The wood was dark and old, polished to a low sheen. Carved into its surface was the split circle symbol, and in the center of the split, a keyhole. Draco approached. His steps felt heavier here, not because the floor resisted him, but because the chamber's stillness made every movement feel meaningful. He reached the cabinet and knelt. The keyhole looked ordinary, and yet it seemed to carry a weight of expectation. Draco held the second key above it for a moment, letting the hesitation exist. Not because he wanted to turn back, but because he understood that once he opened whatever was sealed here, he could not unknow it. He inserted the key. It slid in smoothly, as if the lock had been waiting in perfect readiness. Draco turned the key. There was no click that echoed, no dramatic shift. The cabinet's surface simply loosened, and the hatch lifted slightly, as though the lock had released it from restraint. Draco lifted the hatch fully. Inside was not a weapon. Not a book. Not an artifact that glittered with obvious power. Inside was a shallow recess lined with velvet the color of midnight. Resting on that velvet was a narrow bound ledger, thin, dark and unmarked on its cover, a record. Draco stared at it for several breaths. The idea of a record unsettled him. Records were what people used to trap others in narratives, to create histories that could not be argued with. Records were what his family valued, what they curated, what they preserved to justify themselves. But this ledger did not feel like justification. It felt like witness. Draco reached in and lifted it. The cover was smooth under his fingers, warmer than expected, as though the ledger had absorbed the same quiet warmth as the pendant. It was not heavy, but it carried a density that suggested meaning rather than weight. He opened it. The pages inside were pale, thick, and filled with writing pressed in that same silvery impression he had seen on the parchments. Words formed by pressure, not ink. He scanned the first page. Names. Not many, not rows and rows. A handful, spaced out over time. Some names he recognized immediately, names that belonged to Hogwarts in the way legends belong to old stone. Names that had become part of the castle's identity through stories and memory. Other names were unfamiliar, ordinary, the kind that might belong to students who had passed through without leaving their mark in public narratives. Beside each name was a date, and beneath each date, a short entry. Draco read one entry, then another. They were not descriptions of achievements. They were not records of victories or awards. They were records of private choices. Moments where someone had acted in a way that no one saw. Moments where someone had refused an easy cruelty. Moments where someone had carried a burden quietly. Moments where someone had chosen something difficult without expecting recognition. Draco's chest tightened in a slow, unfamiliar way. He turned another page. Another set of names. Another set of entries. each one small and precise, each one written without sentimentality, but with unmistakable respect. This ledger was not about glory. It was about integrity. Draco's fingers trembled slightly as he turned another page. Not from fear exactly, but from the sensation of being near something that refused to reduce people to their worst moments. He kept reading, slowly, letting the words settle. Then he reached a page where the writing changed. The names remained, but one space on the page was blank, in a way the other blanks were not. It was not an absence waiting to be filled by time. It was an absence shaped like an invitation. A place reserved. Draco's throat tightened. He looked closer. The blank space had a date pressed beneath it already. Tonight's date. 2 minutes past 2. Draco stared at the page for a long time, his mind refusing to accept what it implied. He had expected discovery. He had expected a hidden object, a secret, a mechanism. He had not expected the castle to have prepared a space for him in advance. The pendant warmed in his palm. The warmth was stronger now, unmistakable, like a quiet insistence. Draco's gaze dropped to his hand, to the carved star at the pendant's center. He turned it slightly, letting the dim light catch the carving. The star seemed deeper than it had before, as if the lines had sharpened. He looked back to the ledger. The blank entry awaited. Draco understood then what the second key truly meant. It was not a key to power. It was a key to being recorded. Not by gossip, not by rumor, not by public narrative, by Hogwarts itself. If he did whatever the chamber required, whatever this moment demanded, his choice would be pressed into the ledger and kept within the castle's hidden record, preserved with the same calm respect as those other names. Draco's mind immediately offered him a defensive reaction. Refusal. He could close the ledger, replace it, lock it away, walk out. He could reject the idea of being measured by something that might see him too clearly. But the ledger did not feel like measurement in the punishing sense. It felt like the castle saying that a person was more than the story other people told. Draco's fingers tightened around the ledger. He turned to the page before the blank space and read the entry above it. It described a choice made by someone who had stood at a threshold with the ability to harm and had chosen restraint instead. The entry was brief, but it carried the quiet weight of significance. Draco's thoughts slowed. He realized something with a clarity that felt like ice melting. The ledger was not asking him to become someone else in a single night. It was asking him to offer one true choice, one act of integrity, without witnesses, without performance, without reward. A single moment that could stand on its own. The pendant warmed again, like an answer to his understanding. Draco looked around the chamber. The walls did not shift. The cabinet did not reveal additional compartments. The darkness did not become dramatic. The chamber waited, patient. Then, very slowly, the stone wall opposite the doorway began to change. Not suddenly, not violently. A seam appeared in the stone, faint at first, like a crack in old paint. The seam widened into the outline of a small door, narrower than the one he had entered through, shaped like something meant for quiet passage. In the center of this new door was a star-shaped depression. Draco's breath slowed further. This was the consequence. The second key had unlocked the ledger. Now the chamber was offering him the place where the choice would happen. Draco stood, ledger in hand, pendant in his palm, and approached the small door. His steps were careful, his posture controlled, but inside him something had loosened, something that had been knotted tight for years. He reached the door and lifted his hand toward the star-shaped depression. The pendant's warmth rose sharply, and the carved star glowed faintly, not bright, not visible at a distance, but undeniable in the dimness. Draco pressed the pendant to the depression. The door responded. It softened, then opened inward, revealing a narrow passage beyond. This passage was different from the first hidden corridor. It was not carved like an ancient hallway. It looked newer, smoother, as though the room of requirement had formed it specifically for this moment. The air beyond smelled faintly of parchment and old wood, the scent of libraries, of records, of things kept carefully. Draco stepped through. The passage led him downward, gently, like a slope rather than stairs. The walls were smooth and dark, and the light here came from small star marks set into the stone at intervals, each one glowing faintly as he passed. He walked deeper. The sense of being inside something secret intensified, not as fear, but as focus. The world above, the dormitory, the castle corridors, the ordinary life of school, felt far away now, like a dream he had once believed was the only reality. At the end of the passage, another doorway waited. This one was open. Draco stepped through and found himself in a room that stole the air from his lungs, not in panic, but in the quiet shock of recognition. It was a study, not a classroom, not a library section, but a private study, formed with deliberate restraint. A large desk stood near the center, its surface bare except for a single object. Tall shelves lined the walls, filled with books whose spines were turned inward, hiding their titles, as if the knowledge here was not meant for casual browsing. A high-backed chair sat behind the desk, empty. The room's light was soft and dim, coming from nowhere obvious, settling on surfaces like a gentle haze. And on the desk, placed exactly at the center as if it were the room's heart, lay a single item. A small, silver-white feather. Not a quill, a feather. It looked like it belonged to a bird too rare to be ordinary, its barbs fine and perfectly aligned. It did not shimmer with glamour. It did not glow theatrically. It simply looked important, in a way Draco could not explain. Beside it was a strip of parchment. Blank, waiting. Draco approached the desk. He understood now. The ledger in his hand, the blank entry with tonight's date, the room that had formed this study, all of it converged here. He was meant to write. Not an essay. Not a confession for another person. Not a statement to be judged by teachers or peers. Something else. A truth pressed into record. Draco stood before the desk, the feather lying still, the blank parchment waiting like a quiet mirror. His fingers tightened around the ledger. The pendant warmed in his palm, steady as a pulse. Draco realized, with a calm clarity that made his stomach drop, that the castle was not asking him to explain himself. It was asking him to define himself. Not by name, not by blood, not by family expectation, by a choice that would be written into Hogwarts' hidden record and kept there long after he was gone. Draco reached toward the feather. His hand hovered above it, and in that hovering moment, his mind flashed through every version of himself he had performed. The boy who sneered, the boy who boasted, the boy who tried to be cruel because cruelty looked like strength. He felt the weight of all the times he had used silence as a weapon, and the times he had wanted silence simply because he had no idea how to speak without being trapped by what speaking meant. But tonight there was no audience, no one to impress, no one to punish him. Only the castle, quiet and ancient, holding the space open. Draco lowered his hand and lifted the feather. The feather was warm, not like the pendant's warmth, but like it had been held by living hands recently, as though it remembered touch. He placed the feather's tip to the blank parchment. The moment it touched, the parchment's surface changed, becoming slightly more receptive, as if it had been waiting for a very specific instrument. Draco's breathing slowed to something almost meditative. He did not rush. He began to write, not with ink, not with visible strokes that could be watched from across the room, but with that same silvery impression, words pressing themselves into the parchment as though formed from within. He wrote, without performance. He wrote, without ornament. He wrote the truth of the smallest choice he could not erase from himself, the moment when he could have been worse and chose, quietly, to be less destructive. The moment when he had spared something fragile, not because he thought it would save him, but because something inside him had refused to break one more thing. The writing formed slowly, line by line. Draco's hand did not shake. His posture remained controlled, but inside him something shifted. Not a grand transformation, a loosening, a quiet untying of a knot that had been strangling him for years. When he finished, he lifted the feather and set it down. The parchment remained on the desk, the silvery words pressed into it, steady and undeniable. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the pendant in Draco's palm grew warmer than it had ever been. Warm enough that he felt it clearly against his skin. Warm enough that it seemed to radiate into his fingers. Draco looked down. The carved star at its center glowed faintly, not brightly, not dramatically. A private confirmation. The room's light shifted subtly, becoming slightly softer, as though the space had exhaled. Draco understood that what he had written had been accepted, not by a teacher, not by a judge, by the castle's witness. He stood there, silent, the ledger in his hand. And then, slowly, deliberately, the blank space in the ledger began to fill. Draco looked down. Silvery impressions pressed themselves into the page, forming his name with the same calm precision as the other entries. Draco Lucius Malfoy, tonight's date. 2:02. Below it, a brief description of the choice he had recorded, written in the same restrained, respectful tone as the others. Not praise, not condemnation, simply witness. Draco stared at his own name on that hidden page. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with something close to grief. Grief for the years he had spent believing he was trapped inside one story, and for the quiet realization that there had always been another story possible, one built from small choices rather than loud identities. He closed the ledger gently. The room remained still. The feather lay on the desk, ordinary again. The parchment with Draco's pressed words remained, but the silvery impressions began to fade, not erasing the truth, but transferring it, as if the truth had moved into the ledger fully and no longer needed to remain here. Draco's hand tightened around the pendant. Its warmth had steadied, no longer rising, no longer pulsing. It felt like something that would remain. Draco turned back toward the passage. He began to walk. As he stepped toward the doorway, the study's details softened slightly, as though the room of requirement was already beginning to release this shape. The shelves blurred at the edges, the desk becoming less defined, the light settling into a deeper calm. Draco moved through the passage, the star marks in the wall glowing faintly as he passed, guiding him upward again towards the inner chamber. When he stepped back into the circular chamber, the cabinet hatch was already closed, the keyhole waiting. The doorway to the outer room remained open, and the calm brightness beyond felt suddenly more familiar, more manageable, like returning to the surface after being underwater. Draco crossed back into the outer room. The table waited. The first key lay where he had placed it. The second key remained in his pocket. He returned the pendant to his palm and stood there for a moment, letting the room exist around him. He expected the night to end here. He expected the room to dissolve, the door to close, the secret to become something he carried alone. But the room of requirement had one more shape to reveal. The wall to the right, previously empty shelves, shifted. A single shelf formed, not a row of them, just one, as if the room were offering one final object with deliberate restraint. On that shelf appeared a small folded piece of parchment. It was not blank. It bore a single pressed line of silvery text, short, precise, and deeply unsettling in its implication. The line stated that the record had been made, and that now, as consequence, Draco's secret night was not finished, because the castle did not keep witness only of what someone wrote. It kept witness of what someone did after they were recorded. Draco stared at the parchment. He felt the pendant warm again, just slightly. Then he noticed the most alarming change of all. The door he had entered through, the door back to the 7th floor corridor, was gone. In its place stood a different doorway, newly formed, narrow and tall, its outline etched in faint starlight. The room of requirement had rearranged the path, not to trap him in cruelty, to lead him into the final part of the secret night, something the castle considered necessary after the record was written. Draco stood still, his breathing slow, his mind clear in the way it becomes clear when there is no point pretending. He understood that he could not return to ordinary corridors yet, not until he walked through that new doorway. He stepped toward it, his hand closed around the pendant, feeling its steady warmth. He reached for the handle, and as his fingers touched it, the pendant's star glowed faintly, responding like a key turning inside something deeper than a lock. The door opened. Beyond it was not darkness. Beyond it was a pale, mist-like brightness, the suggestion of a place that did not belong to the castle's ordinary map, a place that felt older than school corridors and newer than memory. Draco stepped forward, and the moment he crossed the threshold, the doorway closed behind him, leaving him inside a space where Hogwarts' final secret waited, something that would decide whether the name pressed into the ledger meant anything at all. The brightness beyond the new doorway was not the brightness of morning. It was paler than dawn, thinner than daylight, like mist that had learned how to glow without becoming obvious. Draco stepped into it and felt the world narrow in a way that had nothing to do with walls. The air here did not smell like corridors or classrooms. It did not smell like torches or polished stone. It smelled faintly of parchment kept too long in careful drawers, of old wood warmed by years rather than flame, of rain that never quite reached the ground. Behind him, the doorway closed without sound, leaving him in a space that did not feel like an ordinary room inside Hogwarts. It felt like being inside an idea Hogwarts had once decided to keep private. For a moment, Draco could not see the edges. The mist light spread evenly, disguising distance, softening the outline of everything. He stood still and let his eyes adjust, letting his breathing remain slow, letting his hand close around the pendant as though it were the only object in existence that could prove he was still in the same night. Then, the space resolved. He was standing in a long hall. Not the great hall, not any corridor he recognized, but a hall built with the quiet architecture of purpose. The floor was smooth stone, pale and clean, marked at regular intervals by star-shaped carvings that sat flush with the surface. Each star gave off a faint glow, just enough to guide a solitary person forward, without advertising that guidance to anyone else. The walls rose high on either side, curved slightly inward, like the inside of a sheltered chamber. They were lined with narrow alcoves, each alcove containing something simple. A single book turned spine in, a small unmarked box, a folded piece of fabric, a stone token carved into a symbol Draco could not place. Nothing was ornate. Nothing was displayed like a trophy. Everything felt kept, as though each item represented a truth Hogwarts had chosen to hold safely, rather than let the world argue over it. The ceiling was not visible. The mistlight made it feel infinite, as though this hall was less a physical place and more a passage inside the castle's memory. Draco took a step forward. The pendant warmed slightly, responding the way it had responded all night. Quiet, steady, never dramatic. The warmth was a strange comfort now. Not because it promised safety, but because it promised consistency. In a life where everything could be turned into rumor or weapon, consistency felt rare. He walked. His footsteps remained muted, not because he tried to hide, but because the hall swallowed noise, as if noise were an unnecessary complication. He passed alcove after alcove, each one holding a single object. The objects did not demand his attention, but they created a steady pressure of meaning, like being watched by 1,000 silent witnesses who did not judge but remembered. He reached a point where the hall widened into a circular chamber. At its center stood a pillar of pale stone, carved with the split circle symbol and the star mark. The pillar rose to a height slightly above Draco's head. Around its base, the floor's star carvings formed a ring, their glow faintly stronger than the ones in the hall. Draco stopped at the edge of the ring. The air here felt heavier, not with threat, but with focus. The kind of focus that made it difficult to pretend. The kind of focus that made performance feel pointless. Bah! On the pillar's front surface was a shallow indentation shaped like the pendant star. Below it was a second indentation shaped like the head of the key. Above it, carved into the stone, was a single line of pressed silver writing. Not ink, not paint, but an impression in the stone itself, as if the words had been etched by pressure rather than chisel. Draco leaned slightly to read it. The message was short, precise, and unsettling in its calm. It described this place as the castle's final threshold for those recorded in the hidden ledger. It implied that what was written mattered, but what followed mattered more. It implied that the castle did not keep witness for the purpose of comfort. It kept witness for the purpose of continuity, so that a private choice did not remain an isolated moment, but became part of a pattern, a direction, a genuine shift. Draco's fingers tightened around the pendant. He understood then what this final space required. Not confession, not explanation, not a second written entry. A proof made physical. A choice carried into action. He looked at the indentations in the pillar again. One for the pendant, one for the key. Draco removed the second key from his pocket. The metal felt colder here than it had in the room of requirement, as if the hall's mist light drew heat away from objects to keep them honest. He held the key in one hand and the pendant in the other. For a moment he hesitated, not out of fear of the pillar, but out of fear of what it meant to place these objects into something the castle had shaped specifically for him. He did not know whether he would get them back. He did not know whether placing them here was symbolic or binding. He did not know whether this was a test he could fail in a way that would leave him trapped inside a story he could not control. But the night had not treated him like a prisoner. It had treated him like a person who could choose. Draco stepped into the ring of star carvings and approached the pillar. He placed the pendant into its star-shaped indentation. The fit was perfect, as though the stone had been carved to match the pendant's exact edges. The moment the pendant settled into place, the star carvings on the floor brightened by a fraction, still dim, still private, but unmistakably more awake. Draco then placed the key into the key-shaped indentation. The key did not slide into a lock the way the other doors had. Instead, it sat in the stone, like a token placed into a waiting mechanism. The moment the key's metal touched the carved recess, a faint line of light traced along the split circle symbol on the pillar, moving slowly from top to bottom. The pillar's writing did not change, but the air did. The mist light thickened, gathering itself, as though the hall was inhaling. Draco felt pressure behind his eyes. Not pain, not discomfort, but the sensation of being turned gently toward something he had avoided looking at too directly. The pillar's surface became slightly reflective, not like a mirror. Like a still pool, Draco's reflection did not appear clearly. Instead, shapes formed, images rising slowly, calmly, as if the hall refused to shock him and preferred to reveal truth with patience. He saw Hogwarts corridors in daylight, students moving, faces blurred in motion. He saw himself among them, younger, posture sharp with practiced certainty. He saw the ease with which he had once believed he understood the world. The image shifted. He saw himself older, shoulders slightly tenser, walking a corridor at night. He saw the way he carried a burden in the set of his jaw, the way he kept his eyes forward, as if looking sideways would break him. The image shifted again. He saw the room of requirement, as it had once been, cluttered, vast, filled with abandoned objects. He saw his own hands moving among things not meant to be touched. He saw a version of himself, trying to construct certainty out of fear. Then, slowly, the images softened into something smaller, a moment that did not look like legend. A moment that did not look like drama. A moment that looked like ordinary reality, held still long enough to be counted. He saw a corridor, dimly lit. He saw an object dropped, something small, perhaps a student's belonging, perhaps a piece of parchment, perhaps something fragile enough to be overlooked. He saw himself notice it. He saw himself pause, despite being alone, despite believing no one. Watched. He saw himself bend, lift it, and place it where it would be found, rather than trodden into nothing. The action was almost insignificant, and yet the hall treated it like a jewel. The image shifted to another moment, another small choice, another quiet restraint. A moment when he could have made something worse and chose to make it slightly less harmful instead. A moment when he could have walked away and chose to intervene silently, without attention. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with the strange ache of being seen accurately. He had spent so long believing he was defined by his worst impulses, his worst allegiances, his worst moments. He had also spent so long believing that any goodness in him was either weakness or accident, too small to matter, too complicated to claim. The hall did not allow that belief to stand unchallenged. It showed the pattern, not a pattern of perfection, a pattern of possibility. The images faded slowly, returning the pillar's surface to dull stone. The star carvings on the floor dimmed slightly, settling back into their private glow. Draco remained standing close to the pillar, hands empty now, pendant and key embedded in stone. He waited. He did not know what came next, but he understood this. The castle was not interested in whether he felt guilty enough, or whether he felt sorry enough, or whether he could speak the correct words. It was interested in whether he could continue making small, unseen choices that moved him away from harm. The pillar's split circle symbol began to shift. The line of light that had traced along it earlier returned, but this time it moved outward, spreading into the stone around it like a quiet network. The pillar's surface softened, and a seam appeared, an outline of a door forming directly into the pillar's base. The seam widened, and a small door opened inward. Behind it was a shallow compartment. Draco leaned slightly, careful not to touch anything necessarily. Inside the compartment was not a treasure. It was a single, plain object. A small, square tile of pale stone, etched with the star mark on one side. A token. A marker. Something simple enough to be kept in a pocket without anyone noticing. Something that would not draw attention, and therefore would not invite performance. Draco lifted the tile. The stone was cool and smooth. The star engraving was clean, precise. As his fingers closed around it, the pendant's indentation in the pillar brightened faintly, and the warmth he had come to associate with the pendant traveled into his hand through the tile. as if the castle were transferring that quiet confirmation into a form Draco could carry without taking the pendant itself. Draco looked up. The pendant remained embedded in the pillar. The key remained embedded too. For a moment, he felt a flash of alarm, an instinctive refusal to leave behind objects he now understood mattered. But then he realized what the castle was doing. It was not taking from him to punish him. It was keeping the proof safe. The pendant and the key would remain here, beyond ordinary reach, beyond ordinary theft, beyond ordinary interpretation. They would not become gossip, or leverage, or a symbol someone else could twist. The castle would hold them. Draco would carry only the tile, small, anonymous, private. The chamber's mistlight shifted again, and the circular room's far wall softened into the outline of a doorway, an exit that had not been visible until now. Draco turned toward it. He did not rush. He walked with the calm steadiness the night had taught him. The ring of star carvings faded behind him as he stepped out of it. He crossed the chamber, reached the new doorway, and passed through. The hall beyond was not the same hall he had walked earlier. This passage felt more like a corridor the castle could produce at will. Smooth stone, gentle curves, dim star marks set into the walls like guiding points. It led upward, slowly, in a long winding slope. The air grew slightly cooler as he ascended, the mist-light thinning as though it was being left behind in layers. Draco continued walking until the corridor ended. A final door waited. This one ordinary in shape, wooden, simple, as if the castle were easing him back into normality. There was no star indentation, no symbol, no keyhole beyond what any door would have. Draco opened it. He stepped into a familiar corridor on the 7th floor. For a moment he stood there, still, letting the return of ordinary torchlight and ordinary stones settle around him. The corridor looked unchanged. The air smelled like the castle. The silence felt like regular night silence, not the dense hush of hidden places. Behind him, the door did not remain. When he turned, there was only the blank wall again. Draco exhaled slowly, not in relief exactly, but in the quiet realization that the night had been real, and yet would leave no obvious trace. No one would find footprints of the secret halls. No one would see marks on the walls. No one would look at him in the morning and know he had walked through something the castle kept private. He began to move back towards the stairs. As he walked, he felt the tile in his pocket, its cool weight, its smooth surface. He touched it once, through the fabric, a small reassurance that he had not imagined everything. The castle remained still around him. Portraits slept. Armor stood silent. No staircases shifted under his feet. Hogwarts felt almost gentle in its cooperation, as if it understood the importance of letting him return without obstacle. Draco descended. He passed windows where the night outside had thinned slightly. The world beyond the glass held the faintest hint of grey at its edges, the slow approach of morning. It was not yet dawn, but it was no longer the deepest part of night. He continued down toward the lower levels, toward the lake, toward the Slytherin common room. His thoughts were quieter now, not empty, but quieter. The relentless spirals had slowed. In their place was a simple understanding that did not need argument. He had been recorded by the castle for a private choice, and then asked to accept the consequence of being recorded, which was to continue choosing differently when no one watched. It sounded small when put into words. It did not feel small in his body. Draco reached the Slytherin common room and slipped inside. The green light was dim, the lake outside still dark. Everything looked as it always did, and yet Draco saw it differently. Not as a stage, not as a fortress, but as a room, built for students who wanted to believe they were untouchable. He crossed it and returned to the dormitory. The beds remained still behind curtains. Sleep held the room in its quiet grip. Nothing had changed. Draco moved to his own bed and paused. He did not immediately lie down. He stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of the night settle into him the way water settles after disturbance. He reached into his pocket and removed the pale tile. In the dimness, the star engraving did not glow. It did not advertise itself. It looked like a simple piece of carved stone, ordinary enough to be ignored. Draco turned it once in his fingers, feeling its edges, the small precision of its shape. He understood that it was not meant to be shown. It was meant to be remembered. He placed it not in his trunk this time, not hidden, not buried, but in the simplest place, beside his wand, among the ordinary items that formed the daily reality of being a student. He set it there as if he were teaching his own hand where to find it when the day made him forget. Then he lay down. The blanket settled over him. The canopy above became a familiar darkness again. His breathing slowed naturally, without effort, without strategy. For the first time in a long time, he let himself be a person in a bed, rather than a name in a story. Outside, the lake pressed against the windows, deep and unmoving. Above, Hogwarts waited for morning. And deep inside the castle, far beyond corridors and classrooms, the pillar in the hidden chamber held the pendant and the key in perfect stillness, as if preserving them was part of the castle's own heartbeat. The night seemed finished. But Hogwarts was not a place that offered secrets without leaving one last thread loose, one last reason to keep listening, one last quiet hook to hold a mind gently in curiosity. Just before Draco's thoughts finally softened toward sleep, a faint warmth pulsed once from the tile beside his wand. So faint it might have been imagined, so brief it might have been only the memory of warmth. And in that single pulse was a message the castle did not need words to convey. This had not been a one-time mercy. It had been an opening. A beginning that Hal would remember. Because somewhere deep within stone and silence, a blank space remained in the hidden ledger, not with tonight's date, which was now filled, but with another date pressed faintly beneath it, so light it could only be seen under the right angle of light. A date that had not arrived yet. A date waiting in the future, like a quiet star. Hogwarts was patient. It always had been. And now it had decided to be patient with Draco Malfoy too, watching not for the moment he performed goodness, but for the moment he chose it again, unseen, unclaimed, quietly real. The castle did not need him to become perfect. It only needed him to keep walking the path he had stepped onto at 2 minutes past 2. And as the night thinned into morning, Draco slept, not peacefully in the way stories promise, but more softly than before, with less tightening in his chest, with less restless circling in his thoughts. Because in the deepest part of Hogwarts, the place that did not exist yesterday had made one thing undeniable. A person could be more than their worst chapter, and the next chapter had already begun. Morning arrived at Hogwarts the way it always did, not as an announcement, but as a gradual softening of darkness into usable light. The castle didn't wake so much as it shifted. Corridors warming by degrees, shadows retreating to familiar corners, the sense of ancient stone preparing itself to hold another day of footsteps and schedules and ordinary noise. Draco Malfoy woke with the strangest sensation of all. Not panic, not dread, not the sharp recoil of memory that usually greeted him before he even opened his eyes. He woke with a quiet certainty that something had changed, and would not change back simply because he wished it. The certainty sat low in him, steady and weighty, like a stone placed in a pocket that would remain there all day whether he acknowledged it or not. He stayed still for a moment, watching the canopy above his bed. His mind tried to test the edges of last night, to see if it would dissolve under daylight logic. The hidden corridor. The chamber of witness. The ledger. The study with the pale feather. The pillar. The tile. Nothing dissolved. The memory remained intact, calm, and disturbingly clear. Draco's hand moved toward the side table where his wand lay. His fingers brushed the small tile he had placed there, and the cool, smooth stone grounded him instantly. It did not glow. It did not warm, simply existed, an object small enough to be ignored by anyone who did not know to look for meaning. Draco dressed with controlled movements, as he always did. The familiar routine steadied him. The simple sequence of fabric and fastening and restraint. He did not glance toward the other beds longer than necessary. He did not search the curtains for signs of wakefulness. The dormitory belonged to sleep's last thin layer and to the first stirrings of morning. Nothing more. When he left the dormitory and crossed the common room, the lake beyond the windows looked lighter, the darkness thinning into deep green. Everything was ordinary. Everything held its usual shape. And yet Draco felt the faintest sensation of being slightly out of phase with it all, as if he had walked through a door inside the castle's heart and returned with a private weight that made him move differently through familiar rooms. He carried the tile in his pocket, not as a charm, not as protection, but as a reminder that the night had been real and that he had been seen accurately by something that did not care about reputation. The corridors filled gradually with students. The ordinary rhythm of Hogwarts returned, movement in groups, the hurry of lateness, the slow drift of those who had nowhere urgent to be. Draco walked among them without drawing attention. He knew how to be unremarkable when he wanted to be. It was a skill he had never needed before, and now found himself using with quiet precision. He did not seek out anyone. He did not look for a face that might reveal knowledge of last night. The castle had made it clear that this was meant to remain private, and Draco was not foolish enough to treat a private thing like a performance. But Hogwarts, as always, tested people with ordinary moments. The first test came without drama. It happened in a corridor, where sunlight reached through tall windows at an angle that made dust motes visible in the air. Students passed in both directions, robes brushing stone, books pressed to chests, a steady flow of ordinary life. Draco noticed it because he noticed details. A small object lay near the edge of the walkway, a thin roll of parchment tied loosely with a strip of ribbon that had come undone. It was the kind of thing that would be trampled without malice, simply because no one looked down often enough. He saw it and kept walking for 2 steps, his mind already offering him the easiest response. Not his problem. Someone else would pick it up. The castle was full of lost things. People survived. Objects were replaced. Then the tile in his pocket warmed faintly. So faintly it might have been imagined if he had not become intimately familiar with that subtle warmth during the night. It was not a command. It was not even insistence. It was a gentle pressure, like a question asked without words. Draco slowed. He shifted slightly toward the edge of the corridor and bent, lifting the parchment with careful fingers. He didn't look around to see who might be watching. He didn't hold it up like evidence of anything. He simply stepped toward the nearest ledge beneath the window and placed the parchment there, out of the main flow, where its owner might notice it and retrieve it later. Then he continued walking. The warmth in his pocket faded. No one reacted. No one pointed. No one turned to see what he had done. The corridor's life continued uninterrupted. And that was the point. Draco reached the end of the hall and felt something unexpectedly difficult settle in him. The quiet ache of doing something decent without anyone knowing. He had been raised to associate actions with recognition and consequence, to measure everything by external response. The absence of response felt, at first, like meaninglessness, but the tile's brief warmth had suggested otherwise. It had suggested that unseen choices still mattered. He went through the day with that thought, moving beneath everything. Lessons passed. Time moved in its usual segments. Draco's face remained controlled, his posture precise, his movements deliberate. No one would have guessed that something inside him was adjusting, slowly, carefully, like a lock turning one notch at a time. Yet, the castle continued to shape small moments into tests. Later, in another corridor, Draco encountered a scene that would once have pulled a familiar reflex from him. The opportunity to sharpen himself against someone else's discomfort. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would create a story worth repeating. Just a small vulnerability in the air. A person moving too quickly, dropping something fragile. A thin glass vial rolled across the stone and stopped near Draco's foot. Draco paused. His mind reached automatically for the old response. Ignore it and move on. Let the world teach its own lessons. Weakness invited consequences. But the tile warmed again, faintly. Draco's gaze fixed on the vial. It contained something pale and cloudy. Not precious in the obvious way, but clearly important to whoever carried it. Draco crouched, lifted it carefully, and set it upright on the floor, where it wouldn't roll again. Then he placed it against the wall, steady and visible. He didn't look up to meet anyone's eyes. He didn't wait for gratitude. He simply moved on, the action as clean and contained as a page turned quietly. Again, no one reacted. Again, the warmth faded. And again, the ordinary absence of acknowledgement pressed against him in a way that felt almost unbearable, like a hunger for a kind of confirmation he had relied on for years. But the tile had offered its own form of confirmation, and Draco began, slowly, to accept that it might be enough. By late afternoon, the weight of the secret night had shifted in him. It was still there, but it no longer felt like a hidden event he had to replay to prove it happened. Instead, it began to feel like a quiet standard set inside his own body, a line he could choose to step toward or away from, over and over, without anyone needing to know. The idea was both liberating and terrifying, because if no one watched, then he could not hide behind performance. If no one watched, then the only thing that mattered was what he actually chose. When evening came, Hogwarts softened again. The rush of daytime corridors eased. Groups drifted towards their common rooms. The castle settled into a quieter shape. Draco returned to the Slytherin common room, and the green light felt heavier in the evening, deeper and more enclosed. He moved through it as though through water, the lake's presence pressing against the windows, like an unspoken reminder that Slytherin's world had always been slightly submerged. He did not go straight to the dormitory. Instead, he found a place at the edge of the room, where he could sit without being central. He kept his posture controlled, his gaze neutral, his presence unremarkable. He did not seek conversation. He did not seek solitude in a way that looked deliberate. His hand slipped into his pocket, fingers brushing the tile. It remained cool and inert now, a simple object again. Draco let his mind drift toward the last detail of the night he had not been able to ignore. The faint date pressed beneath his entry in the ledger, barely visible, waiting in the future. It was not a threat. It did not feel like an appointment in the ordinary sense. It felt like the castle placing a quiet marker in time, a signal that something else would come. Not at random, but when certain conditions were met. Draco wondered what those conditions were. He wondered if it depended on him, on how many small choices he made, how consistent he became, how honestly he moved through unseen moments. He wondered if it depended on the castle, on something it needed before it could open another door. He wondered most uneasily whether he was the only one. Hogwarts was not a place built for single narratives. It held thousands of lives at once. It had watched students make private choices for centuries. It felt unlikely, in the quiet logic of the castle, that Draco alone had been given such witness. The thought settled into him like a slow chill. If there were others recorded in that ledger, others who carried their own secret nights, then he might pass them in corridors without knowing. They might sit in the great hall, eat meals, attend lessons, carry their burdens behind ordinary faces. And if the castle had marked Draco with the tile, perhaps it had marked others too. He kept his face neutral, but his mind became sharper, not with suspicion, but with quiet awareness. He began to watch in a different way, not looking for guilt or weakness, but for the smallest hints of unusual restraint, unusual stillness, unusual private gravity. Nothing obvious appeared. Then, near the entrance to the common room, he saw something small that made his heart tighten. A student, someone younger, posture rigid, movements careful, shifted their bag, and for a fraction of a second, Draco glimpsed a pale square of stone slip from a pocket and be caught again quickly, as if the person had panicked at the possibility of it being seen. The movement was tiny, almost nothing. But Draco's mind latched onto it with the precision of someone who had been searching without admitting it. A pale square, a tile, the same size, the same color. Draco did not stir. He did not turn his head sharply. He did not allow his body to reveal what his mind had recognized. He simply let his gaze pass over the scene as though it meant nothing, as though he had noticed nothing. But something deep inside him shifted. He was not alone. The realization brought an unexpected wave of sensation. Not comfort, not relief, but a deeper seriousness. Because if Hogwarts had begun recording others again, if the ledger was being used now, in this year, at this time, then the future date in the ledger might not be about Draco alone. It might be about convergence. It might be about a moment when multiple secret paths intersected. Draco sat very still, his breathing controlled, his face calm. He waited for the thought to settle without becoming panic. The younger student moved away quickly, disappearing into one of the branching corridors that led toward dormitories. Draco remained where he was. He did not follow. He did not approach. He did not force the secret night into the daylight world of confrontation. The castle had been clear. This record was about choices, made without performance, without pressure, without witnesses. And yet the sight of that tile in someone else's hand had placed a new hook into Draco's mind. If there were others, then the castle's hidden record was not merely a private reassurance. It was a structure, a network, a quiet system of witness designed to shape something larger than one person's redemption. Draco rose eventually and returned to the dormitory, moving with deliberate calm. When he lay down that night, sleep did not come quickly, but his wakefulness felt different now. It was not frantic. It was not a spiral of fear. It was a steady watchfulness. He took the tile from his pocket and held it briefly, feeling its cool surface. He wondered if the other student had felt the same warmth when they made unseen choices. He wondered what had brought them to their secret night. He wondered with a strange heaviness how many people in this castle carried burdens that no one understood. Draco placed the tile back beside his wand. He closed his eyes, and as his mind drifted towards sleep, the tile warmed once, so faintly, so briefly, that it felt like the softest possible signal rather than an event. But this time the warmth carried something else with it. A direction, not a map, not an instruction, not a voice. A subtle pull, like an internal compass shifting toward a point Draco had not been aware of before. He lay very still, letting the sensation settle. The pull pointed upward, toward the higher floors. toward the seventh floor corridor, toward the blank wall that could become a door. Draco's breathing remained slow, but his mind sharpened. The castle was not finished with him. Not tomorrow. Not in a week. Not when he felt ready. Soon. And not only with him, because the future date in the ledger was no longer the only hook. Now there was another, the knowledge that somewhere in Hogwarts, another person carried a tile, felt its warmth, and was being guided quietly toward their own unseen choices. And if the castle was guiding more than one person at once, then the next secret night might not be a solitary path. It might be an intersection. Draco's thoughts drifted, slower now, easing toward sleep with that final quiet cliffhanger held gently in his mind. The seventh floor was calling again, and the castle's hidden system was waking wider than he had imagined. The future date did not sit in Draco's mind like a calendar entry. It sat there like a quiet star fixed behind his ribs, distant, constant, and impossible to ignore once you knew to look for it. Days passed. Hogwarts returned to its ordinary rhythms with the indifferent confidence of an ancient place that has seen countless private revolutions and never once paused its timetable for them. Students moved through corridors. Lessons began and ended. Meals arrived in the great hall as predictably as weather. The castle performed its daily life with such normality that it could make anyone doubt what happened in the hours no one saw. But Draco did not doubt. He carried the proof in his pocket. The pale stone tile stayed cool most of the time, an ordinary object in an ordinary robe pocket, unremarkable enough that even Draco could forget it for minutes at a time. Yet the forgetting never lasted. At irregular intervals, never when he expected it, never at convenient moments, the tile warmed faintly, reminding him that the secret night had not been a single strange occurrence. It had been a door opening into a structure, a system of witness older than the school's daily routines. The warmth did not come with words. It did not come with visions or instruction. It came with alignment. Sometimes it warmed when Draco made a small, unseen correction in the world, moving something out of the path of harm, choosing restraint where old habits would have chosen sharpness, letting an ordinary moment pass without turning it into leverage. Those warmths were brief and gentle, fading quickly, like the castle acknowledging without encouraging performance. Other times, the warmth came with direction, a subtle pull toward a corridor he rarely used, a quiet insistence to take a different staircase, a gentle pressure to pause beside a window and notice something he would otherwise have missed. The castle did not force him. It simply made the correct path feel slightly more present than the incorrect one. Draco began to understand that this was how Hogwarts shaped people when it chose to shape them privately, not with punishment, not with praise, but with persistent, silent correction. He also began to notice the other recorded student again, not often, never clearly. The castle seemed to guard anonymity as fiercely as it guarded the hidden halls. But once you know something exists, you start to notice the edges of it. Draco saw the other student in passing. A controlled posture, a careful way of moving through crowds, an instinct to keep hands close to pockets. He caught a glimpse of pale stone once, quickly concealed. He noticed, too, the way the other student avoided conflict without appearing weak, the way they stepped aside rather than pushing through, the way they seemed to listen for something the corridors were saying beneath the noise. Draco did not approach. He did not follow. He did not try to convert proximity into power. The shared entry in the larger ledger had recorded something difficult and rare. A meeting without harm. Draco understood that trying to name the other student would turn that record into something it was never meant to be. So he kept distance. He kept privacy, and in that restraint, he began to feel, uneasily, quietly proud, that he was doing something his old self would have considered impossible. He was allowing a secret to remain a secret without trying to control it. As the future date approached, the tile's warmth changed. It became more frequent, less gentle, not alarming, but more insistent, like the castle was narrowing its focus. The small, directional pulls became clearer. The subtle urgencies arrived at moments when Draco felt most tempted to fall back into old patterns of avoidance. He would be walking toward the dungeons and feel the tile warm with a steady insistence that pulled him upward instead. He would turn toward a familiar corridor and feel the warmth dim, only to strengthen when he corrected course. It was as if Hogwarts had begun to tighten the thread it had tied to him, drawing him slowly toward a point in time and space that could not be postponed. Draco's sleep became lighter, not restless in the frantic way it once was, but thinner, more aware. He woke sometimes in the hours before dawn, with the tile warm against his skin, and the sense that the castle's hidden halls were stirring. He began to feel, even from beneath the lake, the subtle shifting of something deep inside Hogwarts. An old system waking, turning, aligning itself with the coming date. The castle felt patient, but it also felt deliberate, as if it had waited long enough, as if something that had been sealed for years had begun to loosen. Draco did not tell himself stories about what that something might be. He did not indulge fear into shapes it could bite, but he felt it, the way one feels weather changing before clouds appear, a pressure in the air of the corridors, a sense that some doors were listening. He noticed it most in the evenings. Hogwarts was always quieter at night, but now the quiet carried extra layers. Portraits seemed to sleep more deeply. Certain staircases stayed still for longer. Torches burned with steadier flames in some corridors, and weaker flames in others. Draco felt, occasionally, a faint resistance in the air near particular stretches of wall, as if the castle were reinforcing boundaries where boundaries had begun to thin. Then, on the night before the date, something happened that made Draco stop believing this was only about him and another recorded student. It happened in the great hall, under ordinary candlelight. Draco sat with his house, posture controlled, face neutral, eyes trained on the kind of calm distance that made him difficult to read. The hall was full, loud in the soft way it always was at meals. Laughter, clinking cutlery, chairs shifting, the living murmur of hundreds of students. In the middle of that ordinary noise, the tile in Draco's pocket warmed sharply. Not a gentle warmth, not a faint confirmation, a sudden, unmistakable pulse. Draco's fingers tightened beneath the table. His face did not change. He kept his gaze steady. Then, for the first time since the secret night began, Draco felt something like a response in the castle itself, an answering pressure, as if something deep in the stone had heard the tile and moved slightly in return. Draco's mind sharpened into absolute focus. He did not need to look around wildly to know what had caused it. He felt it the same way you feel two magnets align when brought close enough. Somewhere in the great hall, another tile had warmed at the same time. Two private markers pulsing in one public room. Two recorded students receiving the castle's signal in the middle of ordinary life. Draco kept still, letting the realization land without panic. The castle was coordinating. The future date was not a solitary summons. It was a synchronized one. Draco's eyes moved slowly, not scanning like a hunter, but observing like a person trying to understand the shape of something larger. He noticed a small moment across the hall, a student shifting their robe slightly, fingers brushing their pocket with the quick subconscious urgency of someone confirming something is still there. It was the other recorded student. Draco felt the tile's warmth fade, leaving only a low residual heat. The pulse had done its work. The message had been delivered without words. Tomorrow was not optional. That night, Draco returned to the dormitory early. He did not speak to anyone. He did not linger in the common room. He moved through the green-lit space with quiet purpose. the tile cool again, his mind calm in the way it becomes calm when it finally accepts the inevitable. He lay down fully dressed, not because he expected to run, but because he wanted his body to be ready without fuss. He placed his wand and tile where his hand could find them instantly. He let his breathing slow. Sleep came in thin layers. He woke before the dormitory's quiet began to shift, before the lake light changed, before any ordinary reason to wake existed. His eyes opened and he felt it immediately. The tile was warm, steady, and pulling upward with a clarity that left no space for argument. Draco rose. He dressed more carefully than necessary, not as a ritual, but as discipline. He did not want his hands to shake. He did not want haste to create carelessness. He moved the way he had moved in the hidden halls, quiet, precise, respectful of the secrecy of what he was about to do. He left the dormitory and crossed the common room. He stepped into the corridor. Hogwarts at this hour felt aligned. It did not resist him. It did not distract him with moving staircases or waking portraits. It felt as though the castle had cleared its own throat and was now holding a straight path open. Draco walked upward. The tile warmed in small pulses as he took turns, as if confirming each choice. The corridors were empty. The air was cool and steady. The torchlight seemed slightly dimmer than usual, not because the torches burned less, but because the castle did not need to light this path for anyone else. When Draco reached the 7th floor, the pull intensified. He saw the blank wall. He approached without pacing, without the old desperation that used to make him circle like an animal seeking escape. He stood still. His need was simple and clear. Entrance. The door appeared. It was not the circular mirror room this time. It was not the spare, bright room of his first return. This door opened into a narrow corridor of mistlight, the same pale brightness Draco had walked through when he first reached the pillar that kept the pendant and key. The air smelled of parchment and old wood. The star marks in the floor glowed faintly, forming a path. Draco stepped inside. The door closed behind him. He followed the star-marked corridor forward, letting the pull guide his steps. The hall widened into the familiar circular chamber with the pale pillar at its center, etched with the split circle symbol and the star indentation. Draco knew, without needing to check, that the pendant and key was still held there, embedded in stone, kept safe from the world. But something was different. The star carvings on the floor around the pillar were brighter than last time. Not bright in a way that would hurt the eyes, but bright in a way that suggested the mechanism was awake, fully engaged. Draco stepped to the edge of the ring. His tile warmed, as though it recognized this place as its origin. He entered the ring. The air thickened slightly. The pillar's surface softened into that subtle reflectiveness, the still pool quality that revealed truth without drama. Draco did not look into it for long. He already understood what this place was. Witness, alignment, record. What he did not understand was what action the castle required now. He took his tile from his pocket. The stone was warm in his palm, its star engraving clear. He pressed it to the star indentation on the pillar's base. Nothing happened. Draco held it there, steady. Still nothing. For a moment, the old reflex tried to rise, frustration disguised as contempt, the desire to force the world into obedience. Draco recognized that reflex and let it pass without feeding it. The tile warmed again, as if encouraging patience rather than force. Then Draco understood. This indentation was not for one tile. It was for two. Draco withdrew his tile and waited. He stood in the ring of star carvings, calm and still, breathing slowly. The mistlight remained steady. The pillars' symbols glowed faintly, as if holding themselves in readiness. Minutes passed. The castle did not hurry him. Then the air shifted behind him. Subtle pressure, a quiet disturbance in stillness, the unmistakable sensation of another presence entering the same hidden system of space. Draco, turned his head slightly. A second corridor had opened at the edge of the chamber, and from it the other recorded student emerged. Their face remained indistinct in the mist-light, not because the light was poor, but because the castle guarded anonymity with deliberate care. But Draco recognized the posture, the controlled movement, the careful way of holding their arms close to the body. The other student approached the ring and stopped at its edge. For a moment, both of them stood in stillness, two separate lives intersecting again without words. Then the other student stepped into the ring, slow and deliberate, and lifted their tile. Draco lifted his. Both tiles warmed. They pressed them to the star indentation together. The pillar's split circle symbol filled with pale light, line by line, slow and precise. A seam appeared in the stone behind the pillar. A door formed, older, wider, carved with the split circle symbol repeated in a spiral pattern like a map of quiet stars. The door opened. Beyond it was not simply another corridor. Beyond it was depth, a chamber that felt lower than the castle's foundations, deeper than the lake's pressure, older than the school's daily life. The air that drifted out carried a faint scent of cold stone, and something else, something like metal left too long in water, an old mineral smell that made Draco's mind sharpen. They stepped through. The door closed behind them. The chamber was vast, not grand like the great hall, vast like a hidden cavern shaped by purpose. The floor was pale stone etched with star carvings, arranged in a complex pattern, interlocking rings, spirals, lines that connected points like constellations. The walls curved upward into mist light. The ceiling was not visible, as though the chamber extended into a whiteness the eye could not measure. At the center of the chamber stood a structure like an anchor, a low dais with 4 stone plinths positioned around it at equal distance, each plinth carved with a star indentation and the split circle symbol. Between the plinths, on the dais itself, was a fracture. At first glance, it looked like a crack in stone, but as Draco stepped closer, he realized it was not a physical crack. It was a seam in the castle's deeper magic, a thin, dark line where the mist light dimmed slightly, as though something in the chamber was absorbing brightness. The seam was narrow, but it ran across the dais like a wound, contained, controlled, but undeniably present. Draco's tile warmed sharply. So did the other students, though Draco sensed it rather than saw it. The castle had brought them here to mend something. Not with spells that needed performance, not with teachers, not with public heroism, with recorded integrity, with 2 people who had been measured by unseen choices and found capable of restraint. Draco approached the nearest plinth. He placed his tile into the star indentation. The stone accepted it with perfect fit. The tile's warmth transferred into the plinth, and a faint line of light traced outward across the floor's star pattern. The other student moved to a plinth opposite Draco and placed their tile. A second line of light traced outward, 2 points activated, 2 lines connecting into the larger pattern. The seam in the dais did not close yet. It remained, quietly consuming a fraction of light. 2 more plinths waited, empty. Draco's mind tightened. There were 4 plinths, only 2 recorded students. The castle was asking for 4 anchors. It was asking for something beyond tiles. Draco's gaze moved toward the pillar-like structures carved into the chamber's outer ring, and he saw it. So subtle he might have missed it if he hadn't learned to look for star marks. 2 compartments, set into the stone at opposite ends of the chamber, each shaped like the pillar's compartment from the earlier secret night. Compartments that could contain what the castle kept, the pendant and the key, the proof objects. The objects Hogwarts had hidden and protected. Draco's chest tightened. He understood then what act meant. This was not an action in the ordinary sense. This was a transfer, a risk. The castle had kept the pendant and key safe in the pillar, untouched by theft or rumor, preserved beyond ordinary reach. But now the castle was asking to bring those objects here, into the chamber where the seam in its deeper magic had formed, not as symbols, as anchors. Draco moved toward the nearest compartment. The stone softened at his approach, recognizing him not by name but by alignment. The compartment opened soundlessly, revealing what Draco already expected: the dull silver key and the pale star-carved pendant, both resting in velvet darkness. Draco reached in and lifted the key first. It felt colder here, as if the chamber demanded a more honest temperature from metal. He lifted the pendant next. It was warm, faintly pulsing in his hand like a quiet heartbeat. Across the chamber, the other student approached the opposite compartment and withdrew the matching set. 2 keys, 2 pendants, 4 anchors. Draco and the other student moved in a slow, deliberate circle toward the 2 empty plinths. They did not rush. The seam in the dais held steady, contained, but Draco felt the subtle pressure of urgency, not panic urgency, but timing urgency, as though the castle's deeper mechanism had aligned to allow repair only in this narrow window. Draco placed the pendant into one empty plinth. The stone accepted it. The star pattern beneath the floor brightened along another line, connecting the pendant's plinth to the 2 tiles already set. The other student placed the second pendant into the final plinth. 4 points were now filled: 2 tiles, 2 pendants. The chamber's star pattern brightened, lines of light tracing outward and then inward, forming a web that converged on the seam in the dais. The seam pulsed once, subtle, dark, contained. Then something deeper happened. The air became denser, as if the chamber had drawn in breath. The mist light above seemed to dip slightly, like the chamber was briefly pulling brightness down toward the fracture. The floor's star pattern glowed in a slow pulse, not dramatic, but steady and increasingly unified. The seam in the dais began to close, not snapping shut, not sealing abruptly, closing like a wound, knitting itself carefully, slowly, as though the castle refused to do violence even to repair. Draco stood at his plinth, hand hovering above the key he still held. The key had not been placed yet. The keys were the final anchors, and Draco understood why. Tiles and pendants were proof of choice and witness. Keys were proof of access. Keys were the mechanism that opened and closed the hidden system. If the seam had formed because the hidden witness system had been disturbed, strained, loosened, perhaps awakened too widely, then the keys were needed to lock it back into correct alignment. Draco approached the dais. The seam nearly closed now, the star web pulsing with unified light. At the center of the dais, directly above the last thin line of darkness, was a key-shaped indentation. Draco looked across the dais and saw a second key-shaped indentation opposite it. 2 keys, 2 final turns. A lock that required 2 people. Draco placed his key into the indentation. The metal fit perfectly. Across from him, the other student placed their key. For a moment, nothing moved. Then both keys warmed faintly, responding not to touch alone, but to shared presence. Draco's fingers closed around the head of the key. He waited, feeling for the castle's timing rather than forcing his own. The other student's posture mirrored him, controlled, steady. The chamber's star pattern pulsed once, slower than before, deeper. Draco turned the key. At the same time, across the dais, the other student turned theirs. The keys rotated with smooth resistance, like old mechanisms that have not been used often, but have been maintained perfectly. The moment both keys completed their turn, the chamber's mistlight flared, not bright, not blinding, but fuller, as though a veil had been lifted. The seam vanished, not hidden. Gone, The star pattern beneath the floor settled into a calm, steady glow, and then dimmed slowly back to its original faintness, as though the chamber had completed its work and was returning to dormancy. The air loosened, releasing its held breath. Draco stood still, key still in the stone. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the key released itself, not falling out, but gently nudging backward, as though the lock no longer needed it. Draco withdrew his key. Across the dais, the other student withdrew theirs. The keys, now in Draco's hand, felt lighter than before. Not physically lighter, but lighter with purpose fulfilled. Draco looked toward the plinths. The tiles remained embedded. The pendants remained embedded. The chamber had not returned them. It had kept them. The castle was doing what it always did with meaningful objects, removing them from public reach so they could not become weapons. Draco's chest tightened. He understood that the tile he carried, the proof object he touched in pockets and on side tables, was now part of the chamber's lock. He would not get it back. The other students' tile would remain as well. Their private markers had become anchors in the castle's deeper system. The realization was unexpectedly intimate. It felt like leaving a part of oneself inside stone, not as sacrifice in a heroic sense, but as commitment, a quiet acceptance that the castle had taken their unseen integrity seriously enough to build it into its own protections. The chamber did not offer praise. It offered closure. A doorway formed in the mist light at the edge of the chamber. A return path, simple and calm. Draco and the other student moved toward it without looking at each other too directly. Maintaining the boundary the castle insisted on. They stepped through. The corridor beyond forked quickly into two paths again, allowing separation without confrontation. Draco took his path. He moved through star-marked passageways that rose gently, the mist light thinning with each curve, the air becoming more like ordinary castle air. The corridor ended at the 7th floor. Draco stepped out into torchlight. The blank wall sealed behind him. He stood for a moment in the ordinary corridor, breathing slowly, letting the normality settle around the enormity of what had just happened. He reached into his pocket by instinct. The tile was gone. For a brief instant, a sharp emptiness moved through him, not because he missed the object itself, but because he had come to rely on its warmth as a private signal, a confirmation that unseen choices mattered. He let the emptiness exist. He did not try to fill it with anger or fear. He began to walk back down the stairs. The castle felt different now. Not friendlier, not warmer, more stable, as if some subtle tension in the stone had eased. Torches flickered more normally. The air felt slightly less pressurized. The ordinary life of Hogwarts, the life students assumed was all there was, felt smoother, less strained. Draco returned to the lower levels and moved toward Slytherin. When he reached the common room, the green light felt as it always did. The lake pressed against the windows. Students sat and moved and lived their ordinary routines. Draco walked through it with quiet calm. He reached the dormitory and sat on the edge of his bed. He reached for his wand, placed it neatly, then paused. There was an absence on the side table where the tile used to rest. Draco let his eyes stay on that space. He expected to feel fear. He expected to feel anger at having something taken. What he felt instead was something more difficult and more honest. A quiet seriousness, the awareness that he had participated in something that would outlast his own story. Hogwarts had used him not as a pawn, not as a villain, not as a redemption narrative, as a stitch, a small thread of integrity woven into the castle's deeper protections. Draco lay down, his breathing slowed. Sleep arrived more gently than usual, as though the castle's repaired seam had eased something in him as well. He drifted into rest without replaying every moment, as if the replay could protect him. Morning came again. Hogwarts returned to its ordinary shape. Students filled corridors. Lessons resumed. Meals arrived. The castle behaved as if nothing had happened. Draco moved through the day with the same controlled neutrality. But something inside him was quieter now. Not because his problems had vanished, but because he had done something real. Without witnesses and without reward, he made small choices. He continued. He did not seek the other recorded student. He did not look for confirmation. He accepted that privacy was part of the system. Days passed, and gradually Draco noticed something he had not expected. The castle did not stop watching. The subtle guidance did not vanish completely. It changed form. Instead of warmth from a tile, Draco began to notice warmth in places. A faint warmth in the stone beneath his foot when he stepped away from cruelty. A subtle easing of pressure in the air when he chose restraint. A tiny brightening in the torchlight when he corrected a small harm no one else saw. No one else would notice these things, but Draco did. He understood, slowly, that the tile had not been the source of witness. It had been training wheels. The castle had not removed witness from him by taking the tile. It had moved witness into him by teaching him how to feel it without an object. That realization should have felt comforting. Instead, it made him profoundly alert, because if Hogwarts could teach a person to feel its hidden system directly, then it could also call them directly when the next seam formed. Draco's nights became calm again, but not careless. And then, weeks later, on an evening so ordinary it should have been forgettable, something happened that made Draco stop mid-step in a corridor. A faint star mark glowed on the wall at ankle height, a star indentation he had never noticed before. It was not in the 7th floor corridor. It was not near Slytherin. It was in a passage near the library, high traffic, ordinary, public. Draco stared at it for a moment, his breath slowing. The star mark did not glow brightly. It did not announce itself. It simply existed, newly visible, as if the castle had decided it no longer needed to keep the symbol hidden in only private places. Draco's chest tightened, because a public star mark meant one thing. The hidden system was expanding, not for him alone, not for one other recorded student. For more, Draco continued walking, calm, controlled, but inwardly braced. He reached a window and glanced at his reflection faintly in the glass, not to judge himself, but to confirm that he was still moving through ordinary life while carrying extraordinary knowledge. He turned away and kept going. That night he slept. And deep beneath Hogwarts, in the chamber where the seam had been mended, the 4 anchored points remained steady. 2 tiles, 2 pendants, holding the castle's repaired boundary and quiet balance. In the larger hidden ledger, the shared entry remained pressed into pale pages, and on the page after it, so faint it could only be seen when the mist light struck at the correct angle, a new space had appeared. A blank space, reserved, not for Draco, not for the other student, for someone else. A third recorded name waiting to be pressed into the castle's witness. And beneath that blank space, a date was already there, closer than the last one, near enough to feel like a heartbeat in the future. Hogwarts was patient, but it was also preparing, because the first seam had been mended, and now, quietly, inevitably, the castle was making room for the next kind of secret night. One that would not begin with a key in a trunk, but with a star mark appearing in the most ordinary corridor in the busiest part of the school. As if the castle had decided that some secrets could no longer remain hidden from the lives moving above them. Draco Malfoy moved through Hogwarts as usual the next day, face composed, posture controlled. But as he passed that corridor near the library, the star mark was still there. And this time, it was not alone. A second star mark had appeared beside it. 2 indentations in the stone. 2 places for tiles. 2 places for people who were not yet recorded but were about to be. Draco did not stop. He did not stare. He kept walking, letting the calm of his steps hide the sharpness of his understanding. The castle was widening its width, and somewhere in Hogwarts, somewhere among ordinary students living ordinary days, a hand would soon brush a pocket and feel a warmth they could not explain. A warmth that would turn their life, quietly, toward a door that did not exist yesterday.